The dry, rhythmic scratching of a sharpened reed pierces the humid silence as it sinks into a slab of wet clay. On a sun-scorched mound overlooking the Euphrates, a man with dirt-caked fingernails and shoulders bronzed by a merciless sun performs a strange, clinical act. He holds no sword to slaughter, no scepter to command. He simply presses the reed down, leaving behind tiny, razor-sharp wedge-shaped marks. He has no way of knowing that the moment this mud dries, he has effectively nailed humanity into a new kind of prison, the record. We prefer to believe that writing was born to preserve epic poetry or the whispers of the gods. The raw truth is far more bureaucratic. The first clay tablets didn't chronicle heroes, they tracked debts, bushels of barley, and the precise liters of beer a farmer owed to the state. Writing was the first tool of mass surveillance. Once a number is pressed into clay, it becomes an undeniable fact, an invisible shackle pinning a human being to a fixed point in the hierarchy. Before this moment, humans were ghosts on the savannah, nameless, untraceable, free. But after the reed's first cut, you have a name, and that name is tethered to a balance sheet. To the west, the Egyptians would later use their script to glorify the immortality of pharaohs. But here, in the land between the rivers, writing was designed to manage the lives of the mundane. Why did the dawn of civilization begin not with an anthem of liberty, but with the cold mechanics of oversight? The pungent scent of river mud clings to the air as the tablet stiffens in the 100-degree heat. A single drop of sweat falls, blurring a fresh character, but the gears of the system are already turning. The heavy stillness of this Mesopotamian afternoon masks a brutal transition. We are no longer roaming in tribes to survive. We have begun to live, to serve the mainstream academic debate continues over whether writing emerged independently in Mesopotamia and Egypt or through early cultural diffusion. Regardless, in Sumer, the physical evidence points to a singular motive: governance. The rise of the first city-states is often called the cradle of civilization. But remember, a cradle has two sides. It protects the infant with sturdy walls, but it also obscures the vastness of the sky. Have we truly evolved to become greater, or have we simply perfected the art of self-imprisonment behind a wall of data? The sound of that reed still echoes through 5 millennia. Are you listening to the story of your origins? Or are you rereading the debt contract your ancestors signed in the mud? Imagine a landscape that doesn't want you there. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the earth is a cracked, sun-beaten furnace where the air vibrates at 110 degrees. There's no timber for shade, no stone for shelter, only an endless expanse of silt and the relentless, blinding glare of the sun. To survive here, the early Sumerians couldn't just inhabit the land. They had to break it. In Egypt, the Nile was a predictable clock, a rhythmic pulse that brought life with the gentlest of overflows. But the rivers of Mesopotamia are chaotic monsters. They don't rise with a whisper. They explode without warning, fueled by distant Himalayan snowmelt. One morning, a farmer stands in his field, feeling the grit of dry dust between his teeth. By evening, that same dust is buried under 6 feet of churning, red-brown sludge that swallows his home, his grain, and his children. This unpredictability created a unique psychological trauma. If the gods lived in these rivers, they were not benevolent. They were erratic and violent. To stop the drowning, the people had to do something unprecedented in human history. They had to organize on a massive, grueling scale. Thousands of men and women spent their entire lives knee-deep in suffocating marsh mud, dragging wooden sleds of earth to build dikes that the next flood might simply delete in an hour. It was this brutal physical necessity that forged the first collective labor trap. You couldn't dig a canal alone. To eat, you needed your neighbor. To survive the flood, you needed 1,000 neighbors. The river forced a bargain. It offered life in exchange for your absolute submission to a central authority that could coordinate the shovels. Archaeologists continue to debate the hydraulic hypothesis, the theory that the management of water was the primary catalyst for the rise of despotic state power in the ancient world. As the first dams hardened under the sun, the landscape changed. What was once a wild, fluid marsh became a grid of geometric precision. Water was no longer a gift from the heavens. It was a commodity delivered through a trench. If you lived downstream and a man upstream closed a wooden gate, your family starved. Cubits of power were measured in the flow of silt-heavy water. This wasn't a choice made in a boardroom. It was a choice made by a man staring at a dying, yellowed stalk of barley in a dry ditch. The irrigation canal, meant to bring life, became the first leash. For the first time, a human being's survival depended entirely on their place within a man-made system. By the time the great cities of Ur and Erid arose from the plains, the transition was complete. The people had traded the terrifying freedom of the nomad for the suffocating security of the trench digger. They had conquered the rivers, but in doing so, they had built the walls of their own hive. The Tigris still roared in the distance, but the sound was now muffled by the heavy, rhythmic thud of 1,000 copper hoes hitting the sun-baked clay. Inside the gates of Uruk, the air is thick with the smell of sour fermentation and the suffocating heat of kills. This is the world's first true metropolis, a massive experiment in human density where 10,000 people live in a space once occupied by 5. But the city is not a community. It is a vertical hierarchy made of mud brick and bone. At the base of this pyramid, a laborer kneels in the dust. His lower back is a map of chronic inflammation, scarred by the weight of limestone blocks he drags from the riverbank. He isn't building a home for himself. He is building a mountain for a god he will never see. To keep his muscles moving, he is issued a daily ration of thick, gritty barley ale. It is warm, acidic, and fills the stomach just enough to numb the hunger, but never enough to provide strength for escape. While the pyramids of Egypt were built as eternal vessels for a single divine soul, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia were something different. They were cosmic insurance policies. On the highest terrace, shielded from the stench of the slums by the desert breeze, stands the high priest. He wears a heavy mantle of bleached sheep's wool, soft against his skin, a stark contrast to the coarse, sweat-soaked loincloth of the worker below. He does not labor. He observes. He watches the stars to negotiate with the gods, ensuring the river behaves and the grain grows. But there is a dark irony in the shadow of the temple. The more the city's granaries overflow with surplus grain, the thinner the average citizen becomes. We see this in the skeletal remains of the period, pitting in the eye sockets and stunted growth, evidence of a diet that had collapsed into a monoculture of starch. The success of the civilization was measured by the total volume of grain in the state silos, not by the health of the humans who harvested it. Bioarchaeological studies continue to provide conflicting data on whether the move to urban centers in Mesopotamia led to a net decrease in average life expectancy compared to hunter-gatherer predecessors. The priest-king's power was not just spiritual, it was logistical. He held the keys to the storehouse. To get your bowl of grain, you needed the priest to check your name off a clay tablet. This created the world's first hostage situation. If you didn't work, the gods didn't eat. And if the gods didn't eat, you starved. The gods were essentially the first board of directors, and the temple was the corporate headquarters. A woman stands in the marketplace, clutching a small clay token. It represents 3 days of labor she performed in the communal weaving pits. She exchanges it for a handful of dried fish, already buzzing with flies. This is the birth of the transaction, the moment where human effort is decoupled from its result and turned into a cold, abstract value. Uruk was a miracle of engineering, but it was also a machine for grinding down the human spirit into a manageable resource. As the sun sets, casting long, bloody shadows across the mud-brick walls, the laborer collapses onto a mat of woven reeds. Above him, the ziggurat glows in the twilight, a monument to a greatness he built but will never own. The machine has begun to hum, and once it starts, it can never be turned off. For 2,000 years, the loudest sound in Mesopotamia was in the early city-states, war was a seasonal scuffle between neighbors over a border ditch. It was messy and amateur. Sargon changed the physics of power by creating the world's first professional army. These were not farmers moonlighting as soldiers. They were specialized killers who ate at Sargon's table and slept with their spears. While the Egyptians were focusing their national energy on stone mountains for the dead, Sargon was building a mobile machine of bronze and sinew to dominate the living. The shift is visible in the grid of the battlefield. Imagine the sudden, deafening clack of bronze-rimmed shields locking together, a sound that signaled the end of the individual. Under Sargon, the soldier became a biological brick in a wall of shields. As this wall moved forward, it didn't just fight, it erased. The air became thick with the copper tang of fresh blood, and the smell of kicked-up dust that coated the throats of the dying. The transition from water dispute to total conquest was a slow-motion catastrophe for the old elite. Lugal-Zagizi, the powerful king of Uruk, who once boasted of his divine favor, found himself stripped of his finery. He was placed in a bronze neck stock, a heavy, cold collar that forced him to crawl like a dog through the very gates he once ruled. The metallic scrape of that chain against the stone pavement was a signal to every citizen. Your city is no longer your world. Historical consensus remains divided on Sargon's precise origins, as much of his biography survives only through much later Neo-Assyrian copies of earlier legends. Sargon didn't just conquer cities. He liquidated their sovereignty. He appointed his own governors and standardized weights and measures, turning a patchwork of cultures into a single, taxable organism. This was the birth of the empire, a system where a man in a distant capital decides how much grain a family hundreds of miles away can keep for the winter. The administrative tablet, once used for local debts, was now a tool for continental extraction. A soldier stands in a captured orchard, wiping his blade on a leaf. Around him, the irrigation dikes he was sent to protect are choked with the bodies of those who built them. The empire brought a certain kind of stability, a pax hecatica, where trade could flow from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. But this peace was a byproduct of exhaustion, a quietude maintained by the constant, looming presence of the spear. The great unification was complete, but it had fundamentally altered the human psyche. We stopped looking at our neighbors as competitors for water and started seeing them as subjects of the same shadow. Sargon had proven that a single will, backed by a professional core of violence, could overwrite the traditions of 1,000 years. The age of the city was over. The age of the emperor had begun. In the center of Babylon stands an 8-foot slab of polished black basalt. It is cold to the touch, impenetrable, and etched with the terrifying precision of a master stonecutter. This is the code of Hammurabi. It isn't a set of suggestions. It is a physical manifestation of a state that has finally learned how to automate justice. If you break a man's bone, the state will break yours. The law has become as rigid and unyielding as the stone it is carved upon. While Egypt sought to preserve the natural order through the eternal Ma'at, Babylon attempted to replace the natural order with a legal one. Under Hammurabi, the city became a shimmering mirage of wealth, home to the legendary Hanging Gardens, a vertical forest defying the desert heat. But to keep those gardens green, and to keep the city's million mouths fed, the empire pushed the earth beyond its break. For centuries, the intense, repetitive flooding of the fields had brought salt to the surface. It was a slow-motion ecological suicide. Imagine a farmer waking up to find his once golden field covered in a thin, glistening crust of white. To a child, it might have looked like beautiful snow. To the farmer, it was the breath of a dying land. The salt stayed in the dirt, poisoned the roots, and turned the barley into shriveled, bitter husks. The salinization crisis is a centerpiece of environmental history. Though scholars still debate to what extent it was a primary cause versus a contributing factor to the eventual shift of power toward the northern regions of Mesopotamia. The social system became just as brittle as the soil. Hammurabi's law divided the world into 3 rigid tiers: the elites, the commoners, and the enslaved. Justice was no longer about truth. It was about your price tag. If an elite blinded a commoner, he didn't lose his eye. He simply paid a fine in silver. You can almost hear the soft clink of those silver coils being weighed on a scale, a sound that signaled the official birth of a world where your life has a specific, market-driven value. By the time the later kings attempted to maintain this glory, the foundation was rotting. The frantic pace of irrigation meant the water table was rising, bringing even more salt to the throat of the crops. The empire was essentially a massive machine running at redline, burning its own fuel to stay upright. Every new temple, every gilded gate, was a withdrawal from a biological bank account that had long since reached zero. Walking through a late Babylonian field would have been an eerie experience. The air was still hot, the ziggurats still towered in the distance, but the ground beneath your feet was crunchy and sterile. The vibrant green of the Sumerian dawn had been replaced by a ghost-white wasteland. The civilization hadn't been conquered by a foreign god. It had been choked by its own ambition, leaving behind a black stone pillar and a desert that refused to grow. When the last of the great houses fell and the irrigation canals finally choked on their own silt, what remained was a landscape of silence. Today, if you stand on a dusty mound in southern Iraq, the only sound is the dry wind whistling through the hollows of sun-bleached brick. Beneath your boots lie millions of shattered clay fragments, the debris of a world that invented the way we think, yet lost the ability to sustain itself. They looked at the sky and sliced the infinite into 60-second minutes and 60-minute hours. They mapped the stars with a mathematical coldness that still guides our navigation. While the Egyptians were obsessed with the static perfection of the afterlife, the Mesopotamians were obsessed with the fluid mechanics of the present. They gave us the wheel, the plow, and the base 60 system. You feel their presence every time you glance at your watch or look at a compass. But this intellectual light cast a long, dark shadow. The same hand that calculated the movement of Venus also wrote the bills of sale for human beings. Mesopotamia didn't just invent the city. It perfected the machinery of systematic exploitation. It gave us the concept of chattel, the idea that a person could be a line item on a ledger, no different from a sack of grain or a jar of oil. We inherited their geometry, but we also inherited their blueprint for the permanent underclass. Scholars continue to debate whether the extreme social stratification of Sumer was an inevitable consequence of large-scale agriculture or a specific cultural choice made by the early priest-king elites. We call this progress. But stand in that dust for a moment and consider the trade. We moved from the erratic life of the hunter to the predictable life of the slave. We traded the terror of the lion for the terror of the tax collector. The complexity of our systems grew, but the autonomy of the individual shrank. We became more civilized, yet we became more trapped. A bronze coin in a museum is a beautiful artifact, but for the man who spent 40 years in a weaving pit to earn it, that coin was a shackle. Is civilization a steady climb toward enlightenment, or is it just the process of making our cages more intricate? We are the heirs of Babylon, living in the structure they built, counting our lives by the seconds they defined. As the desert sun sets over the ruins of Nippur, the gray ash of their fires tells a story not of a finished journey, but of a loop we are still walking. Look at the watch on your wrist. Notice the second hand as it sweeps across the dial, ticking 60 times to complete a circle. You are not just looking at a device, you are looking at a ghost. That circular division of time is the heartbeat of a dead world, a mathematical rhythm pulse-coded into our reality by the same people who first knelt in the mud of the Persian Gulf 5,000 years ago. Mesopotamia did not vanish, it simply scaled up. We live in a world of their design, built on debt, defined by borders, and governed by the written word. While the stones of Egypt tell a story of eternal stasis, the dust of Mesopotamia warns us of the fragility of the machine. We have inherited their brilliance, but we have also inherited their blindness. We continue to build sprawling urban hives on a planet with finite limits, treating the earth as a resource to be managed rather than a home to be respected. The salt that choked the fields of Babylon is no different from the carbon choking our atmosphere today. It is the same fundamental error. The belief that a system can grow forever if the accounting is clever enough. We look at their cracked clay tablets and see a primitive people, but we're using the exact same logic of extraction, only with silicon chips instead of reed styluses. A digital bank statement is just a more efficient version of the Sumerian debt ledger. Historians and climatologists continue to study the late Bronze Age collapse to determine if internal systemic failure or external environmental shocks played the more decisive role. The Tigris and the Euphrates still flow through the desert, indifferent to the empires that rose and fell along their banks. They saw the first city rise, and they saw it crumble into a salt-stained mound. They will likely see the end of our cities too. As you silence your phone or pay a bill tonight, remember the man by the river who first pressed a reed into wet mud. He thought he was solving a problem. He didn't realize he was starting an avalanche. We are the children of the mud, still trying to calculate our way out of the prison we built. The question is no longer when civilization began, but whether we are capable of learning the one lesson Mesopotamia left behind. When the foundation turns to salt, no amount of law, or gold, or bronze can hold up. We often mistake history for a linear march toward perfection. But the true lesson of Mesopotamia isn't found in what they built. It's found in what they surrendered in order to survive. Look at the walls of Uruk. They were not raised because humans became more magnanimous. They were raised because the world outside had become too dangerous. The first lesson is this: civilization is a trade-off. We traded the wild autonomy of the nomad for the organized security of the subject. We traded the equality of the tribe for the efficiency of the hierarchy. A white loaf of bread in the hand of a Babylonian laborer looks like progress, but it was purchased with a deformed spine and the permanent loss of leisure time. When you hold a smartphone today, it feels light years away from a clay tablet, but the power structure beneath it is identical. We are still serving systems that have grown too complex for any one individual to control. The second lesson lies in the silence of the salt-stained fields. It is a reminder that every complex system has a biological breaking point. Mesopotamia didn't fail because its people were unintelligent. They failed because they were too clever at exploiting the earth, but too slow to hear its protest. When the white crust finally suffocated the soil, no decree from Hammurabi and no spear from Sargon could command the barley to rise again. Archaeologists and historians continue to weigh whether the collapse of Mesopotamian dynasties was primarily triggered by internal socio-political decay or by irreversible external climate shifts. Ultimately, Mesopotamia teaches us that power is a ghost. The kings who declared themselves gods are now just difficult-to-pronounce names on shards of broken pottery. The only things that truly endured were not the empires, but the tools we created to organize our chaos: numbers, writing, and time. We don't study this history to avoid repeating mistakes. Humanity seems hard